The bustling streets of Washington, D.C. fell silent as an unexpected confrontation unfolded. Barron Trump, the youngest son of the former president, faced a seething crowd, their anger palpable in the air. The tension was electric, but in that crucial moment, Barron didn't retreat or lash out. Instead, he did something utterly unexpected that left the mob speechless. His response, challenging everything the public thought they knew about the Trump family, sparked a transformation. Hostility gave way to something entirely different. This is the story of how one young man's words bridged a seemingly insurmountable divide, offering hope in our fractured world. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across Washington, D.C.'s bustling streets. Barron Trump, his tall frame accentuated by the fading light, stepped out of a sleek black SUV. The community center stood nearby, its brick facade contrasting with the modern government buildings dominating the skyline. As Barron approached, he noticed a small group gathered near the steps. A ripple of recognition passed through the crowd. Whispers circulated, and heads turned his way. Suddenly, a voice cut through the murmur. "Hey, Trump, what do you have to say about your father's policies?" Barron's heart raced, his palms damp with sweat. The acrid smell of exhaust fumes mingled with the crisp evening air. He had always tried to maintain a low profile to stay out of the political fray that followed his family like a shadow. Now, he found himself thrust into the spotlight he had so carefully avoided. The crowd surged forward, faces a mix of anger, curiosity, and expectation. Barron's mind raced through years of media training and family discussions about handling public scrutiny. His throat tightened as he grappled with the weight of his family's legacy and his own desire to forge a different path. As the group pressed closer, their voices rising, Barron caught sight of an elderly woman at the edge of the crowd. Unlike the others, her face wasn't contorted with anger. Her eyes met his, filled with a silent plea for understanding. In that moment, something shifted within Barron. He made a decision that would shape not only the next few minutes, but potentially his entire future. He wouldn't run or lash out. He would face this head-on, in a way uniquely his own. Taking a deep breath, Barron raised his hands in a gesture of peace. The simple action caught the protesters off guard, creating a momentary lull in their shouts. Barron's voice, when it finally came, was steady and clear. "I hear you," he began, the words carrying across the now quiet crowd. "I understand that you're angry, that you're looking for answers, and I want to listen." The protesters exchanged glances, caught off guard by this unexpected response. As Barron continued to speak, his words carefully chosen yet sincere, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. The tension that had been building started to dissipate, replaced by a tentative curiosity and willingness to engage in actual dialogue. The tension in the air was palpable as Barron Trump stood before the agitated crowd. Hearts raced, and breaths were held in anticipation of his response. What came next, however, caught everyone off guard. Barron's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was calm and measured, cutting through the hostility like a gentle breeze on a stormy day. "I understand you're upset," he began, his words resonating with sincerity that caught many by surprise. The crowd fell silent, their expectations shattered. They had come prepared for arrogance or fear, ready to counter with more vitriol. But this quiet strength emanating from the young man before them was something they hadn't anticipated. A man in the front row, his face flushed with emotion, couldn't contain himself. "You can't understand," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Your family is tearing this country apart." The accusation hung in the air, a challenge that Barron couldn't ignore. As the words echoed in his ears, Barron's mind raced. Memories flooded his consciousness. Family dinners filled with heated discussions, passionate debates that often left him conflicted. He had frequently found himself at odds with his father's views, but how could he express that without betraying his family? Barron's eyes scanned the crowd, taking in the myriad emotions etched on their faces. He saw anger, pain, and frustration, reflections of conversations he'd had, and arguments he'd witnessed throughout his life. In each face, he recognized a piece of himself, a shared struggle to make sense of a world that often seemed senseless. "You're right," Barron said, his words causing a ripple of surprise through the gathering. "I can't fully understand your experiences, but I want to try." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. It wasn't a politician's calculated response or a celebrity's practiced empathy. It was the genuine admission of a young man who, despite his privileged upbringing, recognized the complexity of the world around him. As Barron took a step toward the crowd, his hands open in a gesture of peace, the atmosphere began to shift. The confrontation was far from over, but its nature had fundamentally changed. The angry mob that had been ready to tear into him now found themselves face to face with a person, not just a symbol. One woman in the crowd, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, spoke up. "But how can you stand by while your family's actions hurt so many?" Her voice trembled, a mixture of anger and a desperate desire to be heard. Barron took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he met her eyes. "I don't stand by," he said softly. "I question, I challenge, I try to understand, and sometimes I disagree." The admission seemed to cost him, but he pressed on. "But I also know that change doesn't come from shouting at each other. It comes from listening, from trying to see the world through each other's eyes." His words seemed to resonate with some in the crowd. A young man near the back lowered the sign he had been waving, his brow furrowed in thought. An older gentleman in the front row nodded slowly, as if recognizing a truth he had long forgotten. As Barron stood before the crowd, the atmosphere crackled with tension. The polished exterior of the Trump heir began to shift, revealing layers of complexity that few had glimpsed before. His shoulders, once rigid, gradually relaxed. The guarded look in his eyes softened, replaced by a glimmer of vulnerability. Barron took a deep breath, his voice carrying a quiet strength tinged with emotion. "I know you see me as just another Trump," he said, "but I'm also a person trying to figure things out like everyone else." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. They had come prepared for arrogance, not this candid admission of humanity. For a moment, the air hummed with possibility. A woman in the front row, her face etched with frustration, challenged him. "How can you say that when you've lived a life of privilege?" Barron nodded, acknowledging her words. "You're right," he admitted. "I have been privileged. But that doesn't mean I haven't struggled with the weight of my family's actions and decisions." As he continued, the carefully constructed facade of the perfect political son began to crack. The crowd watched, transfixed, as glimpses of a young man grappling with his identity emerged. "I've spent years trying to understand different perspectives," Barron revealed. "I've read books, talked to people from all walks of life, trying to see beyond the bubble I grew up in." His admission resonated with some in the crowd. They saw not just a Trump, but a young adult navigating a complex world, much like themselves or their own children. The realization forced them to confront their own preconceptions. Barron's vulnerability stood in stark contrast to the brash confidence often associated with his family name. It was this unexpected quality that began to soften the hardened edges of the confrontation. The anger that had fueled the crowd's initial hostility began to give way to cautious curiosity. A middle-aged man spoke up, his voice gruff but no longer hostile. "What made you start questioning things?" Barron's eyes seemed to look inward for a moment. "It wasn't one big moment," he explained. "It was 1,000 little ones. Conversations overheard, news stories that didn't align with what I'd been told, the pain I saw in people's eyes when they looked at my family." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The real turning point was when I started to see the world through my own eyes, not just through the lens of my family's beliefs. It was terrifying and liberating all at once." The crowd listened, rapt. The hostility that had charged the air earlier had dissipated, replaced by a tentative sense of connection. They saw in Barron not an enemy, but a fellow human being wrestling with the complexities of identity and legacy. As Barron continued to speak, sharing snippets of his journey towards understanding, the mood of the gathering continued to evolve. What had begun as a confrontation was transforming into something entirely different, a dialogue, fragile but filled with potential. The air crackled with a new energy as Barron's words sank in. Faces in the crowd shifted from anger to confusion, then to reluctant interest. A middle-aged man stepped forward, his brow furrowed with years of frustration. "You say you've tried to understand," the man said, his voice gruff but no longer hostile. "But how can you stand by while your family pushes policies that hurt so many of us?" Barron felt the weight of the question settle on his shoulders. It was one he had asked himself countless times, torn between family loyalty and his evolving beliefs. The crowd watched intently, their collective breath held in anticipation. "I don't always agree with my family's policies," Barron admitted, his voice low but clear. "And I've had many arguments behind closed doors that you'll never see in the media." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't rehearsed political speak. It was raw, honest, and deeply human. For many, it was the first time they had seen a Trump as anything other than a distant political figure. But I've learned that change comes from difficult conversations, from trying to understand each other, even when it's hard, Barron continued. The crowd's mood began to shift, like ice slowly thawing. The anger was still present, but tempered now by a grudging respect for the young man's honesty. Some tension seeped out of the air, replaced by cautious curiosity. A young woman spoke up, her voice trembling. What about the children at the border? What about families being torn apart? Barron's heart clenched. This question had haunted him most, driving a wedge between him and his father during heated discussions. That's something I've struggled with a lot, he said, his voice carrying a hint of pain. I've seen the images, read the stories, it's not right. And I've told my father that. We've had some of our biggest arguments about it. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. I can't change my family's decisions overnight, Barron continued, but I promise you this. I will never stop advocating for compassion and understanding, and I'll use whatever influence I have to push for change. As the conversation continued, something remarkable began to happen. The lines between us and them began to blur. The crowd found themselves engaged in a dialogue they never expected, with a Trump they never thought they'd understand. What had begun as a confrontation was transforming into something entirely different. A dialogue, fragile but filled with potential. The anger and frustration were still there, simmering beneath the surface, but they were now tempered by a growing sense of possibility. The crowd's hostility had given way to a cautious interest, but Barron knew he needed more than words to truly connect. He took a deep breath, steeling himself to share a story he had never told publicly before. His shoulders relaxed slightly as he stepped closer to the gathering, his eyes now holding a vulnerability that caught the crowd off guard. Let me tell you about a day that changed my life, Barron began, his voice soft but carrying. The crowd leaned in, curiosity overriding their initial hostility. Barron's mind traveled back to a day 3 years ago. I was volunteering at a shelter, he said, his gaze distant. I had been trying to understand realities outside my bubble, but nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced that day. He paused, gathering his thoughts. That's where I met Sarah, Barron continued, his voice tinged with emotion. He described a single mother struggling to feed her children after losing her job. She looked at me not knowing who I was, and shared her story, Barron said, his eyes meeting those of the people before him. Her pain, her fears, her dreams for her kids, it was all laid bare in that moment. The crowd listened, transfixed, as they saw a young man grappling with the weight of his family name and the realities he was trying to understand. Barron's voice cracked slightly. I realized then that the policies we debate, the decisions made in distant offices, they're not just talking points, they're people's lives. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of vulnerability that didn't go unnoticed. Sarah told me about how she'd lost her job when the factory she worked at closed down, Barron shared. She talked about the sleepless nights, wondering how she'd keep a roof over her children's heads, and she spoke about her dreams, not for herself but for her kids. She wanted them to have opportunities she never had. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Many of them saw reflections of their own struggles in Sarah's story. They watched as Barron's eyes glistened with unshed tears, his empathy palpable. That day changed me, Barron said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. It made me question everything, to look beyond the narratives I'd grown up with. And it's why I'm here, listening to you today. As Barron finished his story, a palpable shift occurred in the crowd. The anger that had brought them there began to give way to a tentative understanding. They saw not just a Trump, but a young man on a journey of discovery, much like themselves. The air hung heavy with anticipation as Barron prepared to address his family's controversial political stances. His heart pounded as he faced the crowd, their eyes fixed on him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Barron knew this moment would define his relationship with the public. I know many of you are here because of my family's politics, Barron began, his voice steady despite the weight of his words, and I understand your anger and frustration. The crowd held its breath, waiting for what would come next. A man called out, his voice sharp with accusation. Then why don't you speak out against them? The question echoed the thoughts of many present, their eyes burning into Barron, demanding an answer. Barron's mind raced through years of family dinners and heated debates. My family, like any family, is complicated, he said, choosing his words carefully. We have our agreements and our fierce debates. I don't always agree with my family's political stances, but I've learned that change comes from ongoing conversations, from challenging ideas from within. Barron's words hung in the air, challenging the crowd's preconceptions. they saw a young man navigating a tightrope between family loyalty and personal convictions, each step a careful balance between two worlds. "I'm still finding my voice," Barron continued, his vulnerability palpable. "But I promise you, I'm using it where it matters most, in discussions with my family, challenging perspectives, and pushing for understanding." As Barron's words sank in, the crowd's perception began to shift. They saw not a monolithic Trump, but a young adult grappling with his identity and place in the world. A woman in her 40s spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of years of disappointment. "But how do we know you're really making a difference? Words are easy, actions are hard." Barron nodded, acknowledging her concern. "You're right," he said, his voice filled with determination. "Actions do speak louder than words. While I can't share private family conversations, I can promise you this. I will continue to use my voice and influence to push for compassion, understanding, and positive change. It may not happen overnight, but I'm committed to this journey." He looked around the crowd, making eye contact with as many people as he could. "I'm asking for your patience and willingness to see me as an individual. I'm here, I'm listening, and I'm learning. Together we can bridge divides and create the change we all want to see." The air crackled with tension as the woman's words hung in the space between them. "I've hated your family for years," she said, her voice trembling with long-held resentment. The crowd held its breath, sensing this moment could ignite hostility or pave the way for something unexpected. Barron stood tall, his nervousness replaced by calm determination. He met the woman's gaze, seeing beyond the anger to the pain in her face. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across Barron's expression. He hesitated, then spoke. "I'm sorry," Barron said, his voice clear. "I'm sorry for the pain my family's actions have caused you and others." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the defensive stance they expected, but a genuine acknowledgement of hurt. The woman's eyes widened, tears welling up. Her clenched hands slowly relaxed as she processed Barron's words. "I can't change the past," Barron continued, "but your stories shape my understanding and influence my conversations with my family." The atmosphere began to shift. Anger dissolved into cautious hope and newfound respect. People who had been shouting now listened intently, their faces a mix of surprise and curiosity. A man in his 50s stepped forward. "How do we know this isn't just another empty promise?" he asked, his voice gruff but hopeful. "You're right to be doubtful," Barron admitted. "Words are easy, actions matter. But I'm here because I believe in honest conversation. It's the first step towards real change." He paused, looking around. "I can't promise everything will change overnight, but I'll carry your stories with me. They'll inform my decisions and conversations with those in power." A young woman who had been protesting asked, "What about the children at the border?" Barron nodded. "That issue keeps me up at night. I've seen the images, read the stories. It's not right, and I can't ignore it. I promise to advocate for compassion in our immigration policies." As the dialogue continued, the crowd's hostility gave way to respectful engagement. An elderly man spoke up. "I voted Republican my whole life, but lately I've been wondering if I made the right choice. Hearing you speak, it gives me hope for decency in politics." Barron met the old man's eyes. "There's always room for decency," he said firmly. "It's up to all of us to demand it and practice it ourselves." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows, the community center buzzed with newfound energy. The once angry crowd now stood in hushed awe, their eyes fixed on Barron Trump. Maya, her protest sign forgotten, stepped forward and shook his hand. "Thank you for listening," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Barron's eyes scanned the crowd, his voice steady as he spoke. "Today, we've shown that understanding can bridge even the widest divides." The air filled with murmurs of agreement and contemplation. As the gathering dispersed, footsteps echoing in the twilight, many carried more than just signs. They held questions, new perspectives, and a glimmer of hope. Could this moment be the first step towards healing a fractured nation?